Chapter 2, the writing system. The Japanese writing system is surely the largest stumbling block for students thinking about tackling the language. After all, languages like Spanish, German, with their familiar alphabets, seem much more accessible. Maybe throw in a tilde here or an umlaut there, but all in all, it's the alphabet we know and love in English. It's my job to show you that different is not necessarily hard. Actually, I believe that the Japanese writing system is in some respects one of the best design systems in the world. In other respects, it's very challenging indeed. To understand this paradox, we need to learn a bit of history. There was a time in human history when we did not write. So necessarily, some cultures invented writing systems earlier than others. The leader in Asia was China. With a culture that goes back at least 5,000 years, the Chinese began writing basic pictograms perhaps 4,000 years ago. These pictograms gradually evolved into a stylized set of characters that eventually could express any possible sentence, which is the basic requirement for a full-fledged writing system. As a brief aside, it's interesting to think about why pictograms by themselves cannot form a real writing system. Remember rebuses? I do not. These picture games use symbols to spell out sentences by using puns and word associations. I used to love them as a kid. They work something like this. They'd have like a picture of an eye and a heart and the letter U, and they'd form a sentence like I love you or I heart you. The reader, using a bit of imagination, can translate this into a sentence like I love you, but this technique has a serious drawback. It's hardly fit for responding or for representing more complex sentences. How would you write? I love it when you do your hair like that. Because there are no clearly defined rules about how pictures go together or work. Even if you figure out some clever way of representing the sentence, the odds are very small that anyone else would be able to decipher what you meant. It turns out that to have a useful writing system, you can't just draw pictures and hope that the reader can guess your intent. You have to have a unified system with rules that everyone agrees on. The Chinese accomplished this by creating characters that were not merely pictures of things you can see and touch, but also of abstract concepts. Plus the rules for using them all in actual sentences. By any account, this set is bulky and hard to learn, consisting of tens and thousands of characters, but it was successful in that it was a true writing system capable of recording everything from business transactions to love songs to official matters. The Chinese brought the characters to Korea, Vietnam, and Japan. Japan received these Chinese characters around the year 400 AD, and soon thereafter, officials in Japan began writing Japanese using Chinese characters. The Japanese name for these Chinese characters is kanji. There was just one problem. Japanese and Chinese are totally and completely different languages. To understand what happened, let's imagine how it might look if, instead of kanji being imported into Japanese, they were imported into English. Transport yourself for a moment, if you will, to a parallel universe, one in which English has no writing system. As we start our tale, we English speakers are living out our lives and going about our business, muddling along with no written system. Perhaps we have crude characters and some basic symbols, but certainly no means of writing something like a newspaper or grocery list. Now the Chinese show up at our doorstep and tell us about their fantastically weird squiggly marks. They tell us that these strange things can record thought. The idea is utterly fascinating, so we decided to see if they might work with our language. At first, everything seems fairly straightforward. There's a Chinese character for each kind of thing in the world, so to write down any sentence, you just find the character for each word and write it down in order. So the sentence I like ramen is easy. Just find the characters for each word, write them down, and now anyone can read it back in English and get the exact sentence you originally meant. Make no mistake, at this point you're not writing Chinese, you're writing down English sentences using Chinese characters. Splendid. Speakers of Chinese, we'll note that I'm taking some liberties with these examples, bear with me, they're just for illustrative purposes. But soon challenges appear. Take the sentence, he bought the cat. The first and last characters are easy. But what about the word the? The Chinese language doesn't have an exact match for this word, so obviously there's no character for it. What to do? Someone comes up with the idea of recycling an old character that isn't used much in Chinese for the word the in English. So far, so good. But what about the word bought? In English, some words change form to indicate tense, but in Chinese, past tense verbs are usually formed by using the present tense verb, buy in this case, plus another character, which makes it past tense. So now we have to use two Chinese characters to get the one English word bought. As I hope you can see from our little thought experiment, trying to write English using characters that were designed for Chinese would soon become fairly complex, above and beyond the simple fact that we're required to memorize a large number of characters. And that same problem occurred when these early pioneers tried to graft Chinese characters into the very, very different language that is Japanese. In fact, in my opinion, it would be much easier to write English using Chinese characters than Japanese. The fictional examples above are a cakewalk compared to what ancient Japanese written in pure Chinese characters looks like. Let's get back to the story. Our early Japanese friends began writing their language using Chinese characters, but the Chinese writing system was complicated to begin with, and now that they were trying to use it to write an altogether different language, it was even worse. So it took a lot of training and practice to master the system, which meant that only the rich and powerful could afford the time and effort to learn it. Everyone else had to spend their days just attending to basic food and shelter needs. But here's where it gets a little interesting. Japanese culture at the time believed that women were not capable of learning such a complex system, so even the women who happened to be born into wealthy families agreed, and were generally not educated deeply in using Chinese characters. But these women wanted to write, so they began to do something quite extraordinary. For each syllable they wished to express, they chose a Chinese character that could be pronounced that way, and used the character to represent only that sound, discarding the actual meaning of the character. For example, the Japanese word for sky is soda. There's a Chinese character that all by itself means sky. I'd show you, but this is an audio podcast. In the old system, a Japanese writer who wanted to represent the word soda would write this single character. But instead of doing that, our heroines using this new system would choose one character that could be pronounced so, and another that could be pronounced ra. They put them together and said, totally disregard what the character happens to mean in Chinese, just pronounce them out loud to make a Japanese word. Early editions of this app suggested that women were the ones to create the system, which is called Manyogana. Manyogana, I think. Having happened so long ago, it's not totally clear who came up with the idea. It is certain, however, that the women described above were early users and popularizers of it. Just a moment here. It looks like there's a chart here that indicates the kanji for sky, pronunciation of sora. There's also a kanji representing the word once, the pronunciation so, the kanji meaning good, representing the pronunciation ra. The upper line of the chart shows the old method. One character meant sky because the Chinese said so. When a Japanese reader saw that character, they would read it as soda, which is how to say sky in Japanese. In the bottom two lines, we see two characters that were selected to represent the sounds so and ra. The original meanings of once upon a time and good were completely ignored. Only the sounds were important. Putting the two characters together, they could pronounce the reader could pronounce sora to get soda. There's another example here, a character that's pronounced as a, one as ka, and one as mo. Eventually, one character was chosen to represent each of the one-syllable sounds in Japanese. Since Japanese is based on a very small number of basic sounds, this meant that it was possible to write Japanese phonetically using only a few dozen characters instead of tens of thousands. Quite an improvement. To help make clear what happened, think about Egyptian hieroglyphs. For years, scholars struggled to figure out how they work. They appeared to be pictograms, but there was something peculiar about the system. There were many characters, but a few of them showed up way more often than they ought to. Were the Egyptians really writing about birds and snakes that much? The major breakthrough occurred when scholars realized that the pictures were really just representations of sounds. A picture of a bird probably started out meaning a literal bird, but over time came to represent just a particular sound, the B sound, let's say, and the pictograms evolved into symbols for pronunciation. It was exactly the same thing when the Japanese began using Chinese characters to represent sound only. The original meaning of the characters no longer had any bearing on the sentence. A Chinese person looking at a stream of characters could used this way to express Japanese would have been completely baffled, just as an Egyptologist were when they tried to literally make sense of the hieroglyphs. Later, these characters were further simplified so they could be written in a few basic strokes. They now had completely lost any meaning remaining, or excuse me, they had completely lost any remaining connection to the original Chinese meaning, and the result was a uniquely Japanese set of around 50 or so characters. Today, it's 46. We can truly call that an alphabet since they represent sounds, not meanings. This was a breakthrough for writing in Japan. Here, there's a table showing original Chinese characters, a simplified form, and the pronunciation for them being a, ka, and mo. This revolutionary alphabet is more accurately called syllabary because each character represents a whole syllable, not just a part of a syllable. In English, for example, most letters like K cannot be pronounced by themselves. They need a vowel to make a complete pronounceable syllable, such as ka. I've gone into this detail for two reasons. First, I think it's fascinating, and I hope you do too. But secondly, and more importantly, it'll help you understand the current state of the Japanese writing system. The Japanese syllabary, as I described above, is a wonderfully simple and elegant system. Its name is hiragana. It is as close to a perfect writing system as I can imagine. We'll be learning hiragana over the next few lessons. By the time we finish learning it, you'll be able to write any Japanese word in Japanese. Hiragana also has a cousin syllabary called katakana. I call it a cousin because there's exactly one katakana character for every hiragana one, and usually they look similar. It's a bit like the difference between block letters and cursive script in English. Cursive letters generally look similar to their block counterparts, but occasionally they take slightly different forms. There's an example image of some English cursive and some English standard text. Just as we write foreign words like vis-a-vis in italics, katakana is used almost exclusively when representing words that come from foreign languages, like computer, for example, computer in English. So we'll learn it a little later on at a more relaxed pace. If Japanese used only hiragana and katakana, collectively called kana, it would be one of the simplest writing systems in the world. Alas, the picture is a bit more complicated than that. See, when writing hiragana and katakana, when those were invented, Chinese characters didn't just roll over and die. Keep in mind that kanji were associated with wealth, power, and education. So for centuries, most of the people who had those continued to write extensively in kanji. There's an image here of some hiragana compared to katakana as well. The katakana being notably much more square, with the hiragana having much rounder features on it. After World War II, laws were passed that limited the kanji that could be used in newspapers to a fixed set of about what is that? About a little under 2,000 characters. Everything else was to be represented in hiragana and katakana. These sets of characters have changed a little over the years, and today consist of about 2,000 characters called jio kanji, or daily use kanji. So although it is much easier to be literate in Japan now than in the past, you still do have to know kanji. We won't spend a lot of time learning kanji at this early stage, because in order to really make sense of them, it helps to understand the basics of Japanese already. Keep in mind that the Japanese children don't start learning kanji until they already speak Japanese fluently. But we will talk about them from time to time so that you can understand how they fit into Japanese. Then later you'll be able to make a more detailed study of them if you decide to do so. Well, now that we understand in broad terms how the Japanese writing system works, let's have a look at our first set of hiragana characters. But first, take a brief pause to quiz yourself and make sure you understand what we've learned so far. By successfully passing the quiz here, you'll unlock the next chapter. And then there's some information about using the application itself, so we won't do that, but I will record myself doing the chapter review. That's loading up here. True or false? Hiragana characters represent sounds only. I'm going to say true. And that was correct. Which syllabary is used for ordinary Japanese words? I don't know if this really counts as a syllabary. I'm going to say hiragana. The options are hiragana and katakana, but katakana is used for foreign words. So hiragana was correct. Approximately when did kanji come to Japan? I think it was about 400 AD. I'm going to select that. That was correct. What is the name for Chinese characters used in Japanese? That's kanji. That was correct. Which syllabary is used almost exclusively for foreign words like computer? And that would be katakana. So I'm going to select that. Got it. What is the main purpose of katakana? The options are to look cool, to represent pure meaning, to represent Japanese words when you don't know the kanji, and to represent foreign words. I'm going with that last option. That's correct. True or false? Hiragana were derived from kanji. If I remember right from what I just read, they were picked from the kanji themselves and then kind of isolated. So I'm going to say true, though they don't have any inherent meaning like the Chinese characters do. That's correct. True or false? Kanji are no longer used in Japan. Unfortunately, that's not true. Kanji are used regularly. That was correct. Roughly speaking, how many hiragana characters are there? There's about 2,000. No? Hiragana characters, not kanji. Damn. I'm going to say 50. That was correct. Which writing system came from China? That's kanji. And here comes the results. 4 stars, 9 out of 10. Misread the other one. Big bummer, but we'll move on. And that'll be it for chapter 2. Chapter 3 will be hiragana part 1.